Okay, so the first step in soldering is the edge soldering, and before I get started I make sure that my metal is clean, which allows the solder to melt properly. And next what I need to do is add a substance called flux. Flux allows the solder to flow into where it needs to go, so we need to melt the solder into the seam between the two pieces of metal. Flux is kind of like a substance that is sugar mixed with water. It's sort of a grainy and pasty texture. And you'll take your paintbrush and just paint the flux down. Flux also saves the metal from something called fire scale. So when you heat up metal, it oxidizes and it has like a burned look to it. And so the flux will save the metal underneath of it. Of course, there is also another way to clean it, and we'll get to that later. So my metal is set up on the soldering block. I put flux on. Now what I'm going to do is add the solder. So I have two small clipped pieces of solder. And I'm using a higher heat solder. So I can use medium or hard solder, and I'm going to put one piece of solder at the top of the seam, going across, and one at the bottom, just like that. Okay, so now I'm going to get my torch started and get the correct flame, and then I'll start heating up the metal to melt the solder. Make sure you have a very sharp flame. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up a little bit so that you can see how I heat up the metal. I don't want to heat right on the metal because the flux will start to boil, and when the flux boils, the solder will start to dance and it can be shifted from where it's supposed to be. So I'm going to start by keeping my torch head pointed directly down, and I'm going to heat up the brick around the metal first. And the very tip of that darker blue flame on the inside part of the flame is just grazing the soldering block. And as I start to heat up the block, it will begin to heat the metal, and my flux will start to slowly evaporate, or the water with the flux will evaporate, and you can see that the flux is starting to turn white. So that means the water is leaving the flux. So now that the flux has no water in it, I'm going to circle the outside of the metal. And you can see the pace that I'm going at, sort of a steady, slow heating. The metal is going to start to change color as it heats up. So the flame is not directly on the solder, it's going around the solder. We're heating the metal up, and then the solder will begin to melt. is going to start turning a reddish color. And then as it gets hotter, it will start to glow, which we're getting to that point. And soon the solder will melt. And as it melts, it will seep into the cracks. So I'm just going to kind of go up and down to push the solder into the cracks until it's completely melted. So for edge soldering, make sure the solder is completely melted and that it goes into the cracks. Okay, so as soon as I remove the heat, the metal turns sort of to a dark color, it loses the glow, and then once you're finished, you're going to wait a minute until it cools just a little bit, but then you're going to be picking up your metal with your tongs and you're going to be quenching it in water.